All right, folks. Well, welcome, and thank you very much for being here for this latest talk. Um, Let me see. Actually, I'm going to stop here for a second, take a step back. I just want to fix one thing that's giving me a hard time. There we go. Okay, great. All right, so starting again. Um, Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your coming out to these talks. Uh, Today, we're going to talk about something that I hope you're maybe getting an inkling of right now as you look at the screen. We always talk with one of these lovely icons created by Jonathan Anderson in collaboration with Nico Bryan and myself. Um, and this is a different one. Is that strange to you? Would it be strange if I were to carry on talking from here, introduce the talk that we're about to have? What is user experience? Hint, you're having one right now. Um, would it be strange if it were to start that way instead of with the usual icon that we start with? And instead of introducing things the way we usually do, reviewing the ideas, going over the things we've already talked about, would it be strange if we started here instead? I imagine it would. I imagine it would feel a little bit abnormal, a little bit unexpected. That's what this icon is about. This icon is about the idea of the user's mental map, the mental map of the person who is experiencing what you're presenting to them. And when you have something in line with their mental map, then you're giving them an experience they think is intuitive for all the reasons we've talked about before. When you're giving people something that isn't in line with their mental map, then it's unintuitive and requires thinking and creates conflict with them for all of the reasons that we talked about before. So in order to avoid that conflict with you, my friends, let's return to our normal format and go forward from there. So today we're going to be talking about user experience, sort of like we just did, but maybe a little bit longer, for about 60 slides, actually, so a fair bit longer. And the thing about user experience is that it builds neatly on the ideas we've talked about. The fact that we have these emotional biases in all of our perceptions that distort our ability to judge the value of new information compared to what we already have as our mental models. And that prevents us from learning things. It also prevents us from evaluating our own abilities with any kind of accuracy. So to go into that in a little bit more detail, falling back once again, in order to match your mental map of how these talks go, let's take a look once again at how this can be broken down in terms of the three processing systems inside our skulls. So our reflexes respond quickly and unthinkingly to all stimuli, neural stimuli. And the patterns that we sense in those stimuli trigger emotional responses. And then the slow, deliberate reflection, the ability to read and write and apply logic, those and count, those things can mitigate those biases. They will be colored by them, but if we're careful, then the slow, deliberate thinking can realize that it's being affected by these emotional biases and can take control of how we perceive new information. So to break it down slightly differently, our brain causes biases, as we've discussed for the last few lectures, in how we think and how we learn, what we think about new information. And those biases shape whether or not we can learn anything at all. They even shape our willingness to try to learn new things. If that has never occurred to you before now, or maybe before last week's lecture, I assure you it's occurred to a lot of other people. And the experiences that you have online and using other computerized systems are largely shaped by people who have thought about that an awful lot. That may seem a surprising question, but that's where I want to start. Has your computer ever tried to kill you? And if it had, whether you think about it now or not, whether you agree now or not, if it has ever tried to kill you, um, if it has ever tried to kill you, Would you keep it? Well, let's come back to that whole idea later. Not sure what that notice was, but hopefully that'll be the last one. Um, so yeah, let's come back to that idea. Has your computer ever tried to kill you? If it had, would that be reason enough to give it up? Um, it's funny. My computer isn't currently trying to kill me, but it's certainly distracting me when people are posting things there, and I'm not sure why they are. Anyhow, it's not an issue I can deal with right now, so I'm going to carry on. Let's talk about UX. We'll come back to the whole idea of our computers trying to kill us. The idea of UX, or user experience, comes from a number of different fields, and it has a long and storied background. In computer science, for decades, we've talked about the idea of computer-human interaction, and then human-computer interaction, putting the human first. And some factions cling to one or the other for various reasons. In engineering, we talked about human factors, which was the simple idea that in any problem, you have mathematical factors. And the factors are the things that add up or multiply together or divide across one another to make up a result. So something can be broken down into its factors. So when looking at problems of dealing with actual experiences using engineering materials or other materials in the workplace, in the field is how it really started, I guess. People would say, well, there's technical factors, and eventually they were separating that into software and hardware factors, and then there were environmental factors, and there are human factors, the things that are purely human-based. In industrial design, going back to the early days of automation, people talked about motion studies, and then came on to talk about ergonomics and many different kinds, branches, subfields of ergonomics. In marketing, there was a term that came along later than the others called customer experience, sort of based on these earlier ideas of ergonomics, but tinted towards selling. And really all of those ideas, all of those disparate ideas that have become UX are dealt with absolutely beautifully in the beginning of a wonderful film called Modern Times that was released in 1936 by Charlie Chaplin. If you haven't seen that film, I cannot encourage you strongly enough to see it. Back when Chaplin was making that movie, the last of his movies to feature The Little Tramp, Henry Ford was the savior of American industry and the creator of modern industrialism. Fred W. Taylor came along and created a way of counting the efficiency of people on the assembly lines that made Ford so successful, and figuring out how to make people more efficient, literally by counting their movements, clocking them. And then there were Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who, as anyone who knows me knows, are two of my heroes. They created what they called third-links as units of activity, whether it's mental activity, cognitive activity, or whether it's taking a physical action or looking for something, improving Taylorism to some degree, and saying that all work could be measured this way, empirically. Lillian Gilbreth is not just there for being the second half of this partnership. Unknown for some reason in most of modern American society, Lillian Gilbreth is a great hero, should be a hero to all engineers, to everybody who studies efficiency, to every woman who wants to be recognized on par with men. And I know these days it's unusual to even think about that because that's just expected, though it's not happening. It's just expected. Please look up the history of Lillian Gilbreth. I've never seen a children's book written about her, but there should be some. I've never heard a song written about her, but there should be some. A truly marvelous woman who was a great thinker and a great scientist, and who used the situation she was in to become the most famous engineer of her time. Anyhow, it's a long story and deserves its own hour-long talk, not just half hour. Then there's people who worked on other aspects of it. Dieter Rams, the German designer, weniger aber besser, less but better. Paul Fitz, who studied, the psychologist who studied the specific way or figured out the specific way to measure the difficulty of doing tasks by measuring the difficulty of the task itself, creating a standard for it, and then comparing others' performances, individual performances to that standard to see how good they are at tasks. It's just amazing. Edward Deming went to Japan after the Second World War and introduced the idea of really strict quality control at every step of production. An idea that he had developed in the US, but that wasn't really catching on. And in Japan, it caught on. And some people say that's the biggest reason that Japan went from a copycat industrial nation to a standard-setting industrial nation within a couple of decades. Vannevar Bush, David Beatty, Douglas Engelbart, all great thinkers. Vannevar Bush was the head scientist for America under two presidents and wrote a wonderful short manifesto called As We May Think that predicted the modern desktop computer. The arrangement, actually, of the desktop interface that we still have for some reason on our phones. I can't recommend that strongly enough either. David Beatty was the guy who, a former pilot in the, I think in the British Air Force, certainly a former pilot from Britain, who came up with the idea of cockpit and then crew resource management, CRM, that revolutionized the application of performance standards and cooperation standards to the cockpit, saving millions of lives. And Douglas Engelbart, of course, who, along with the technician whose name I cannot recall now, but whose name I will insert in the notes, Douglas Engelbart, who invented the computer mouse and ended up calling it mouse just because of an accident of perception. Then there's Don Norman, who decided that instructions could be broken down into formal steps. There's Ben Schneiderman, who just has a really cool name, and that's the only reason he's there. Just kidding, but please look him up. And speaking of really cool names, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi has maybe the coolest name in my field. And it's funny that it's kind of difficult and intimidating to try to read his name or speak it aloud, because he's the guy who formalized the study of flow and how we do things unconsciously without thinking. Then, of course, Bill Buxton, the great UX researcher from Toronto. Larry Tesler, who passed away earlier this year, the man who invented cut and paste and a number of other shortcuts that everybody uses without thinking. Ivan Sutherland, who created the first graphics software back before there were computers that could easily process graphics. Are you having as much fun as I am? Is there sort of a hypnotic quality to this listing of names like that, the sort of Kant with the slight explanation and then Kant carrying on and on like that? If so, if you're enjoying that process, then I'd like to tell you a story. And if you're not enjoying that process, then I'd like to tell you a story in order to take a break from that process. In fact, let's not just have a story, let's go for another imaginary walk. But this time, we won't go back to the 50s like we did the last couple of times. Let's just go back specifically to October 21st, 2009. And for our walk, let's try walking along the aisle between the seats of a particular plane. A plane with 144 passengers on board. And I think it was 3 or 4 flight attendants and 2 pilots, a pilot and a co-pilot. Now, I understand that some folks are listening to these and not watching them, so I'm going to summarize the slide a bit more thoroughly. We are currently standing on the deck inside the cabin of a Northwest Airlines Airbus flight, or Airbus A320, flight 188. There's 144 passengers on board, and the flight attendants have been trying for some time to get through to the captain and co-pilot, who are non-responsive. Interesting situation, right? So this is a Northwestern flight, but Northwestern had just been acquired by Delta, and it's a regular flight. It happens a couple of times a day. They're flying from San Diego up to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and this is a story of alerts and wrong numbers and text messages. It's a story of Winnipeg. Yeah, I'll explain why. And it's a story of a whole bunch of things going wrong. First, let's try to figure some things out here. Let's not try to figure that out. We keep trying to figure that out. We've talked about it enough. That's purely force of habit that I put it in here. That's not intended at all. Let's look at this much nicer curve here. This is the regular flight path, and I hope you can all see it okay, from San Diego up to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And the flight takes a few hours. And like I say, it's a normal everyday thing. You take off from an initial airport, you achieve your flying altitude, you coast along on autopilot, and then when the time comes, you land. Now, in between times, there's a few things you do. You check in with air traffic control as you go past the other airports that you can see there. Like, they're not too far from Las Vegas and Phoenix. They're very close to Denver. They're definitely flying over Denver's airspace here, you can see. And then you head on to Minneapolis and St. Paul. And Winnipeg, which I mentioned, that's way up here. And no, I'm not saying the plane is going to go up to Winnipeg. Goodness, no, that would be ridiculous. No, that's not what the plane does. What the plane does is it goes along its projected route. And both of these screenshots, by the way, are from the great flightaware.com website. I strongly advise you checking it out if you're interested in flight paths. So you can see they're coming along and they're approaching Minneapolis, St. Paul, and they went right past it into Wisconsin, and then did a loop around and a loop back and a loop around and landed. So by the time they turned around, they were about 70 minutes past their destination, which is kind of cool. Now, there's a lot of stories about how and why that happened. And to give you some of the basic facts, the pilot and co-pilot, like I said, were working for Northwestern, which had just been acquired by Delta. And Delta had, according to the story I heard back when I was working in accident investigations and from contacts that I maintained afterwards, Delta had imposed a new policy for booking time off. It was their normal policy. They weren't being rude. That's just how they do it in their company. And the Northwestern folks were at risk of losing any holiday hours they had booked. And the pilot was worried about this because, and no, I'm not going to name him, and I'm not going to name the co-pilot for reasons that I hope will come clear in a couple of minutes. He was worried that he wasn't going to be able to get his booked holiday, which he had booked under the previous system. And he had booked it early because his son was coming home from war, and he wanted to spend time with his son. Now he was worried that wasn't going to happen. So the co-pilot assured him, hey, I've done this before. I know how to do it. We'll open up our laptops and get to work. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, there's a law against pilots doing non-flight related stuff on laptops inside the cockpit. And there is a law against that. That law was created because of this story I'm telling you. Not because of the way I tell it, but because of the actual incident more than a decade ago. So they took out their laptops and they started working. And there was some interaction with the outside world just before that happened. So the pilot got up to go to the bathroom. I think he also ordered his meal or something like that. He came back. While he was gone, the co-pilot chatted with the air traffic center for that airport, Midway Airport I showed you in the picture, right? The Denver airport. And they got into it. They started looking at the software, and the next thing they knew, the flight attendant, one of the flight attendants, was telling them that they were way past time. Now that's their version of the story, or that's the mainstream version of the story. And there are other versions of the story. And again, I'll get into that in a minute. The thing is, air traffic control had no idea where they were at all. They weren't responding. They had a good idea where the plane was, but there was a really wide circle where they could have been. If you think about it, lost contact for, even if it's just the 70 minutes that they went beyond their target, lost contact for 70 minutes means a very wide flying circle where they could have been lost. There was fear that maybe they had been hijacked. There was an alert put out to a local Air Force base that maybe, according to the Pentagon, maybe planes should be dispatched to try to warn them, maybe shoot them down if necessary. All of this was going on. Now, that said, I want to remind you of what we talked about in terms of stories last week. I hope you remember the story about the elephant, and more specifically, the story about the people who were asked to describe an elephant and whether they were men or women and where they were and whether they were blind or in the dark and things like that. And the story isn't just a story about trying to describe an elephant as a whole without getting lost in the details of the one part that you can touch. It's also a question of getting that story right without, when you tell it, without getting lost in the details of the story. And that's really important here, because the pilot, one of the close friends of the pilot, another pilot, released a letter to the press that they had communicated between them, telling a slightly different version of the story that made the two pilots look like they were less lost and more out of contact because of a series of 7 to 10 errors that were made by them and by other people. But the general feeling at the time was that these pilots got lost in their work. They got lost in their work, and because of that, all kinds of disaster could have happened. The plane could have been shot down. But it's more than that, isn't it? Why didn't air traffic control reach? Why didn't other planes in the air reach them? They did actually contact Winnipeg, but they believed that it was on the same frequency as Denver, or sorry, as Denver had advised them to switch to for their next stop. So there were a number of issues, or at least they say, according to this letter, that they believe that there were a number of things that went wrong. It seems that nobody responded correctly. Everybody was getting software alerts, and the pilot and co-pilot clearly miscommunicated something between themselves and clearly lost track of time for a while. And the different air traffic control centers lost track of the flight for a while when a shift change happened. So the real story underneath all of those details, and they're much messier than what you'll find in the press, the real story there is that a normal everyday event, a flight that happens a couple of times a day, got messed up and nobody responded to it properly. Which brings me back to the question that I startled you all with at the beginning. Has your computer ever tried to kill you? And would you keep it if it did? What if I told you that your most ubiquitous computer, the computer that you use more than any other computer, is responsible for 1.6 million car crashes every year, according to data from a couple of years ago, the most recent data that I could get. And that in those car crashes, this same computer is responsible for 390,000 injuries per year and 3,166 deaths per year. If your laptop was responsible for 3,100 deaths a year, would you want to use that laptop? What if I told you that just having this computer in your possession, activated while driving, increases your risk of being in an accident by 5 times? What if I told you that one of the things you do most with that computer causes you to be 23 times more likely to be involved in an accident? Now, of course, the computer I'm talking about is an old Dell desktop. No, of course, the computer I'm talking about is your phone. Distraction through phone use is responsible for all of these statistics. And those numbers, though they seem weird, 5 times and 23 times, those are accurate numbers as of a couple of years ago. I don't imagine they've gone down. So, would you keep a computer that is trying to kill you? Keep in mind, when I say it's trying to kill you, I don't mean it was programmed to do that. I just mean that its programming causes it to do that. We have, as we've been talking about for these talks, all kinds of patterns that we've learned to follow. And we follow them even when it's not good for us to do so. When they are activated, we follow the pattern. The activation of that doesn't involve the slow and careful reasoned consideration that we think it does. We do things, right, simply according to stimuli that we have a built-in response for, or stimuli that we don't have a built-in response for and that we have to use one of our default responses for. So familiar stimuli trigger familiar responses, right? That's the simple way to look at it. If this always happens as a result, then you will respond the same way again and again. And some of these responses are as quick as reflexes, while others are much slower. They're reactions, not reflexes. like that limbic stuff that we talked about before. Reactions, not reflexes, but still so much faster than reason. So because of all that, because of the ways that we've discussed it in detail before, we know that it's our nature to react quickly and emotionally to things based on the out-of-date information that we think is more valid because it's out of date. And we react to this information with unthinking routines, which means we don't have the self-awareness or situational awareness to consider whether or not we should be reacting that way, because self-awareness and situational awareness come with reflection, which is slower. And that's how we fall into the trap of doing the same old response to a new situation. And it is a trap. It's why jokes work, right? And it's also why judo works. Once you get past the initial pushing and shoving of the beginner, judo works because you're anticipating how you can make someone respond. Right? In a judo throw, it looks like you grab someone, say, osotogari, you grab someone and hook your leg behind their leg and push them to the ground, but you don't. What you do is you grab someone and convince them that they have to shift themselves and the shift of balance that will enable them to trip over your leg and fall down. If you do it right, it's their force, not yours. Of course, this is also the behavior that works for natural selection too, as we discussed last time. Unfamiliar reactions to familiar responses will separate those who get to have kids from those who don't, in simple genetic terms, in simple terms of natural selection. And once this has happened, once we've responded the wrong way to a new situation, because we assumed it was like the old situation, once we've done that, then we're left trying to decide, okay, did I make a bad choice? Or did somebody deliberately try to trick me like these other times when I've been surprised by outcomes? And if you consider for a moment that somebody was trying to trick you, not just some twist of fate, but someone, or a lot of people, or an organization, or that's it. It was a conspiracy all along. Oh, I'm not sure who was involved. It could have been that waiter I met last year, and it could have been my ex-wife, but I'm not sure exactly who, but certainly the president and some lizard people from under the earth, certainly all of them are why I bit my tongue while I was making my coffee this morning. It's obvious because I've made coffee many times without ever biting my tongue. Basically, embarrassed at being wrong, it's easier for us to believe that we were right instead. That's just the default of how our brains work with these three competing systems working at different levels of thinking and at different speeds. And it's easier for us to believe that even if nobody else reinforces that idea. But if that idea gets reinforced in the right way, and by right, I mean wrong, if that idea gets reinforced, then our embarrassment can quickly turn into indignation and then outrage, right? Remember, please, as the great Spider Robinson says, that anger is always fear in disguise. And embarrassment is just another form of fear, right? So our embarrassment turns into indignation and outrage, and we dig in and we stand our ground and we defend a right to make our own decisions. You don't get to tell me what to do. Is this beginning to sound familiar at all to those of you watching and listening during the pandemic of 2020? We feel this way even if those decisions, very deliberately in quotation marks, were formed and shaped through careful conditioning, not by us thinking slowly and carefully, but by someone else who's taken the time to do that before exposing us to the idea. They have carefully and slowly figured out how to expose us to ideas so that these decisions seem like ours. It would have to be someone we trusted and listened to and watched. Someone who is willing to take advantage of the way that our brain can be manipulated. Someone eager to form our opinions and our decisions, which we then, as I said, will defend with blind certainty, confident that what we are doing by standing up for this with absolute certainty is we are standing up for ourselves, we are standing up for our standards. But at the same time, that blind certainty means that we're incapable of the kind of self-examination that would let us realize that in being so obstinate, we aren't living up to our own self-image, our own high standards for who we should be. And to give you an example of that, because some of you might be thinking, oh, I see where he's going, and some of you might be thinking, I have no idea where he's going. So just to clarify, let me give you an example. This app from I Say Online Services, introduced to the Apple Store in 2010, Type and Go. It's been called a couple of things. Type and Go is this great app that lets you look through the screen of your phone while you're typing. So you can type and look through the screen and see everything. And it's all intended to make walking while texting safer. But please take a look at the central picture. Can you all see the central picture? Okay, I probably should have done a shot where that's bigger. Right? In the central picture there, you can see the street in front of him, right? As he's walking or she's walking or it's walking and looking with one hand at the phone. You can see the street in front of them, can't you? Here? The problem is you can't. No. There's a few reasons why you can't. If you're looking at the text on the screen, then you're not looking through the text. Your attention is not there. Also, if you're looking at the screen, then you're not looking around yourself, which is really what you have to do if you want to be safe walking in the street. I think they realized this themselves to some degree, because even in the picture they used, our iconic friend in the middle is looking forward and walking across the street, but the picture on their phone is looking sideways, as though they'd turned their head and their phone at the same time to look and see if traffic is coming. It's just truly a terrible, terrible thing, which is probably why it was removed from the App Store after 3 years. But it got a lot of really high reviews and 1 million downloads all around the world. At a buck a download, that's not bad. Now, it could be that that example I just gave isn't what you were expecting. It could be that you thought I was going to maybe use the rant prior to that picture to talk about politics. Maybe that's where you thought I was going. That's certainly considerable, I guess. It's something you could, yeah, it's a good notion. I could have been going somewhere else. Who do you think put that idea in your head with all of the examples that I used before in the previous weeks and today? Of course, you expected me to go on a specific path there. And of course, it wasn't the path of seeing that single app from the iPhone. If you would like to think about who's putting notions in your head, and if you would like to self-calibrate more and more efficiently and more often, and if you'd like to help others think about putting ideas in heads and self-calibration, then please do. And if I can help in any way, please let me know. Thank you very much. I leave you with a quote from my first book, which will not probably be up here long enough for anyone to read right now, but I look forward to your questions. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. Cheers. There we are.
Thank you, John.
My pleasure, Michael.
Always fascinating and fun to listen to you speak.
Thank you very much. Kind of you to say that. Oh, I see your comments now. HAL 9000 and Apple Maps with really bad directions. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, that's a flight tracking website, and they'll show you real-time information about the paths of any flights and also some historical stuff. So,
yeah, my comment was about a computer ever tried to kill you.
Ah, right. Yes. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were on that mission. That must have been traumatic when I brought it up.
I'm sorry, Dave.
So that was a bit of a winding road today. Does anyone have any questions about the path we've just walked?
No, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're both very welcome. It's a pleasure. Like I've said before and will persist in saying again, delivering these talks is a really great pleasure in my days these days. And I thank the company for it. Well, if there's no other questions, then I guess I can end things here. Folks, if any of you want to chat, but you don't want to be recorded, just let me know and we'll make sure that the recording is stopped after the talk. There's no problem doing that. Okay. Anyway, that's a question for next time. Take care, everybody.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
John.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Corey.
John.
Thanks, John.
Cheers. Thank you.